One particularly cold morning, when frost covered everything and the world looked like it was made of ice, Thomas discovered something that made his heart stop. There was blood on the fence post where the Dark Colt stood. Not a lot of blood, just a small amount, but it was enough to tell Thomas that the horse had been pushing against the fence, pressing hard, trying to break through or reach something on the other side. The blood was frozen now, turned dark red and hard as stone. Thomas touched it carefully with his fingers, and he felt a terrible sadness wash over him. His horse was hurting himself, and Thomas still did not know why. That afternoon, Thomas did something he had never done before. He saddled up his old mare Lucy and rode toward the neighboring property. He did not have permission to go there, but Thomas did not care about permission anymore. He needed to understand what the Dark Colt was so desperate to reach. The neighboring land belonged to a man named Edward, who was younger than Thomas and who did not take good care of his property. Edward had moved there 3 years ago and had mostly abandoned the ranch. He spent most of his time in town, drinking at the bars and gambling his money away. His land had fallen into disrepair. The fences were broken, the barn was falling apart, and nobody really knew what was happening on that property anymore. Thomas rode slowly through the snow, following the fence line, looking for anything that might explain the Dark Colt's strange behavior. The wind was so strong that it pushed him sideways in the saddle. The snow was so deep that Lucy could barely walk through it. Thomas's face was numb with cold, and he could barely feel his fingers holding the reins. But he continued on, determined to find the answer to this mystery. As he rode deeper into the neglected property, Thomas began to hear something. At first, it was so quiet that he thought he was imagining it, that the wind was playing tricks on his ears. But as he got closer, the sound became clearer. It was the sound of an animal crying. It was a sad, lonely, desperate sound that made Thomas feel like his heart was breaking. He followed the sound toward a ravine that he had never noticed before, a deep cut in the land where the ground had worn away over many years. When Thomas reached the edge of the ravine and looked down, he saw her. She was a young mare, maybe 3 or 4 years old, with a thin body and a coat that was dull and matted. But it was not just her appearance that made Thomas gasp. It was what he saw wrapped around her legs. Barbed wire. Old, rusty barbed wire that had become tangled around her body, holding her prisoner in that terrible ravine. The wire had cut into her skin, and there were places where blood had frozen on her coat. Thomas could not understand how this had happened. He could not understand why Edward had left this horse here, trapped and suffering, with no food, no water, and no shelter from the freezing cold. As he looked at the young mare, he began to understand something. He began to understand why the Dark Colt had been standing at the fence. Somehow, the stallion had heard this mare's cries. Somehow, across the distance and through the wind, across the fence line and through the snow, the Dark Colt had heard his neighbor suffering, and he had positioned himself at the fence to be near her, to watch over her, to keep her company even though he could not reach her or help her. Thomas felt tears freezing on his face as he realized the truth. The Dark Colt had been standing in the freezing cold not because he was sick or cursed or crazy. The stallion had been standing there because he loved this young mare, because he was loyal, because he refused to abandon her, even though she was trapped on the other side of the fence, even though standing there in the cold was hurting him, even though nobody understood what he was trying to do. Thomas sat on his old mare Lucy and cried. He cried for the young mare trapped in the ravine. He cried for the Dark Colt's devotion and loyalty. He cried for the suffering of these innocent animals. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he had to save them both. Thomas did not go back to his ranch immediately. He sat on Lucy's back for a long time, just looking down at the trapped mare in the ravine. The sun was already beginning to set, and darkness was coming fast. The sky was turning from gray to black, and the wind was getting stronger. Thomas knew he had very little time. If he did not help the mare tonight, She might not survive until morning. The cold was too intense. Her body was already weak from hunger and suffering. One more night in that ravine could be the end for her. Thomas made a decision. He climbed down from Lucy carefully, his old joints protesting with pain. He was not as strong as he used to be, and climbing down into a deep ravine in the darkness was dangerous. But Thomas did not hesitate. He secured Lucy to a tree and began the difficult descent into the ravine. The rocks were slippery with ice. The wind howled around him, trying to push him off the narrow path. Thomas moved slowly, placing one foot carefully in front of the other, holding on to the rocks with hands that were numb from cold. When he finally reached the bottom of the ravine, he could see the young mare clearly. She was even thinner than she had appeared from above. Her ribs showed through her dull coat. Her eyes were filled with fear and pain. When she saw Thomas, she tried to move away from him, but the barbed wire held her firmly in place. The wire had cut deep into her legs, and there were places where the wounds had become infected, where the skin around the wire had turned a sickly color. Thomas approached the mare slowly, talking to her in a soft, gentle voice. "It is okay, girl. I am here to help you. I am going to get you out of this wire. You are going to be okay." The mare watched him with wild eyes, not sure whether to trust him or to fear him. But Thomas kept talking, kept moving slowly, kept being calm and patient. Gradually, the mare seemed to understand that he meant her no harm. She stopped trying to pull away. Thomas examined the barbed wire carefully. It was wrapped around her legs in several places, tangled and knotted in a way that seemed impossible to untangle. This must have happened months ago, Thomas thought. This poor animal had been suffering in this ravine for months, trapped and alone. How had she survived this long? How had she not given up? Thomas had brought work gloves and tools with him, though he had not known exactly what he would need. He had a knife, a pair of wire cutters, and some rope. He began carefully, very carefully, trying to cut the wire without cutting the mare's skin even more deeply. Every time he cut a piece of wire, the mare would flinch and try to move away. Thomas would have to start talking to her again, calming her, convincing her to stay still. The work was slow and difficult. Thomas's fingers were so cold that he could barely feel them. The wire was thick and hard, and the cutters were old and not very sharp. Several times the wire slipped, and Thomas almost cut his own hands. Blood from his fingers mixed with the frozen dirt on the ground. But Thomas did not stop. He could not stop. Every time he looked at the mare's face, every time he saw the pain in her eyes, he found the strength to continue. Hours passed. The darkness became complete. Thomas could barely see what he was doing anymore. He worked by touch, feeling along the wire, finding each knot, working each piece loose. The mare grew quieter as the night went on. Thomas was worried that she might be giving up, that her body might be shutting down from the cold and the pain and the suffering. He talked to her constantly, telling her stories, encouraging her, promising her that she would be free soon, that she would be warm and safe. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the last piece of wire fell away. The mare was free, but she could not stand up. Her legs had been trapped for so long that they did not work properly anymore. She tried to put weight on them and fell immediately. Thomas felt his heart break. He had freed her from the wire, but her body was so broken that she could not walk. Thomas sat down in the snow next to the mare and cried. He cried from exhaustion. He cried from sadness for this poor animal. He cried because he did not know how he could possibly get her out of this ravine. She was too heavy for him to carry. She could not walk, and she would die here if he left her alone. But then something happened that made Thomas look up. In the darkness above the ravine, he heard a familiar sound. It was the sound of a horse neighing. It was the Dark Colt. Somehow, the Stallion had followed Thomas. The Dark Colt had come to this place where his mate was trapped, and he was calling out to her. Thomas scrambled up the side of the ravine, his body aching, his hands bleeding. When he reached the top, he found the Dark Colt standing there, waiting for him. The stallion was making a low, soft nickering sound, a sound of comfort and encouragement. The Dark Colt seemed to understand what needed to happen. He seemed to know that they had to work together to save the mare. Thomas had an idea. It was dangerous and probably would not work, but it was the only chance they had. He took the rope from his pack and created a makeshift harness. He carefully made his way back down into the ravine with the other end of the rope. He somehow got the rope around the young mare, positioning it so that it would support her weight. Then he made his way back up to the Dark Colt. "Come on, boy," Thomas said to the stallion. "We have to pull her up. We have to do this together." The Dark Colt seemed to understand. He backed up slowly, pulling the rope taut. The rope began to work, and gradually, slowly, the young mare began to move up the side of the ravine. It was not easy. The mare's hooves scraped against the rocks. The rope stretched and creaked. But the Dark Colt did not stop pulling. He pulled and pulled with all his strength, and inch by inch, the trapped mare was lifted out of that terrible ravine. When she finally reached the top and collapsed onto the flat ground, Thomas fell to his knees in the snow. He had done it. They had done it together. The Dark Colt stood over the young mare, nickering softly, touching her with his nose, making sure she was alive and safe. Thomas watched them in the darkness, and he understood that this was what love looked like. This was what loyalty looked like. This was what it meant to refuse to abandon someone you loved, no matter what the cost. The young mare could not walk. Her legs were too weak, too damaged from the months of being trapped. Thomas tried to help her stand, but every time she put weight on her injured legs, she would collapse back into the snow. Thomas felt desperate. They were still on Edward's property, miles away from his ranch. The temperature was dropping even lower as the night grew deeper. The wind was becoming stronger, more fierce, more dangerous. Thomas knew that if they did not get this mare to warmth and shelter soon, she would not survive the night. The Dark Colt stood beside the young mare, refusing to move away from her. He nickered softly, a sound of encouragement and comfort. Thomas watched the stallion, and an idea came to him. It was a desperate idea, but it was the only one he had. Thomas went back to where he had left Lucy tied to the tree. He brought his old mare down to where the young mare lay in the snow. "Lucy," Thomas said to his horse, putting his forehead against hers, "I need you to be stronger than you have ever been. I need you to help me save this life." Lucy nickered as if she understood. Thomas had some rope left in his pack. He fashioned a sling, a makeshift contraption that would allow him to support the young mare's weight. He tied one end to Lucy's saddle and the other end around the mare's body, being very careful not to hurt her any more than she was already hurt. When everything was secure, he led Lucy forward very slowly. The rope became tight, and gradually it began to support some of the mare's weight. She could not walk on her own, but with the rope helping her, with Lucy pulling her forward slightly, with the Dark Colt pushing against her from behind, they could move. Progress was agonizingly slow. Every step took forever. The young mare would stumble, and Thomas would have to stop everything and wait for her to find her balance again. The snow was deep, sometimes up to their knees, sometimes deeper. The wind cut through their clothes like sharp knives. Thomas's face was so cold that he could no longer feel it. His fingers were numb inside his gloves. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, some stranger who was forcing him to keep moving, even though his body wanted to give up. Thomas looked back at the Dark Colt and felt amazed by the stallion's devotion. The black horse had not left the young mare's side for even one moment. He was pushing against her, helping support her weight, whispering to her in those soft horse sounds that only she could understand. The Dark Colt had suffered so much, standing in the freezing cold for so many days, watching and waiting for this moment. Now he was using the last of his strength to help her survive. An hour into the journey, Thomas was not sure they would make it. The young mare seemed to be getting weaker, not stronger. Her breathing was becoming shallow. Her eyes were becoming glassy. Thomas recognized the signs of an animal giving up, an animal whose body was shutting down from the cold and the pain and the exhaustion. Thomas felt terror. He could not let her die. Not after everything. Not after coming this far. "Come on, girl," Thomas said to the mare, his voice rough from cold and emotion. "You have to keep going. Your friend needs you to keep going. The Dark Colt loves you. He has been waiting for you. You cannot give up now." Thomas did not know if the mare could understand his words, but he kept talking anyway. He talked about warm barns and fresh hay and water that was not frozen. He talked about spring coming, about green grass, about peaceful days in the sunshine. He talked about the Dark Colt and how he would take care of her and protect her forever. Slowly, the young mare seemed to find something inside herself. Maybe it was the hope in Thomas's voice. Maybe it was the presence of the Dark Colt beside her. Maybe it was some instinct to survive that was buried deep inside her. Whatever it was, she seemed to find strength from somewhere. Her breathing became a little stronger. She kept moving forward, one painful step after another. The Dark Colt stayed with her constantly. When she stumbled, he would push her back up. When she seemed to be losing her way, he would nudge her in the right direction. When the wind would push against them, the stallion would position his body to shield her from the worst of it. Thomas watched this with tears freezing on his face. He had never seen an animal love another animal so completely, so selflessly, so perfectly. Finally, after hours that felt like days, Thomas recognized landmarks. They were getting close to his ranch. The fence line that separated his property from Edward's was just ahead. When they crossed that boundary, Thomas felt a surge of hope. They were almost there. They were going to make it. The barn was a glorious sight when it finally came into view. The wooden structure was dark against the snow, but to Thomas, it looked like the most beautiful building in the world. It meant warmth. It meant shelter. It meant safety. It meant life. Thomas opened the barn doors and carefully guided Lucy and the young mare inside. The Dark Colt followed, never leaving the mare's side. Inside the barn, it was warm. The temperature was so much warmer than outside that Thomas could barely believe it. The other horses were sleeping in their stalls, warm and comfortable and safe. Thomas immediately began working to make a comfortable space for the injured mare. He spread clean hay in a stall, filled water troughs with warm water, and brought blankets to cover her. The young mare collapsed into the hay, completely exhausted. The Dark Colt lay down beside her, his body touching hers, sharing his warmth with her. Thomas brought more blankets and covered them both. Then he sat down on a hay bale and cried. He cried from relief. He cried from exhaustion. He cried because they had made it. They had survived the impossible night. The mare was alive. The Dark Colt was alive. And Thomas knew with absolute certainty that from this moment forward, nothing would ever separate these two horses. They belonged together. They had proven it by facing death itself and refusing to let it take them. That winter slowly released its grip on the valley. The snow that had covered everything in white began to melt. The frozen ground became soft again. The bare trees began to show tiny buds of green at the tips of their branches. And with the changing season came a change in the young mare as well. Her body began to heal. The wounds from the barbed wire slowly closed and became scars. The terrible cuts that had seemed so deep and so permanent began to fade. Her ribs, which had shown so clearly through her skin when Thomas first found her, slowly disappeared as she gained weight and strength. Her coat, which had been dull and matted and lifeless, began to shine with health and vitality. But the greatest change was not in her body. The greatest change was in her spirit. When Thomas first brought the young mare to his barn, she had been broken inside as well as outside. She had been trapped and suffering for so long that she had lost the will to live, lost the ability to trust, lost her faith that the world could be anything other than pain and darkness. But slowly, day by day, the Dark Colt taught her to believe in love again. The stallion would stand beside her in the barn, sharing his food with her, his water, his warmth. He would nicker to her softly throughout the day, and gradually her eyes began to brighten. Gradually she began to eat more. Gradually she began to move around her stall without pain. Thomas spent countless hours with the two horses. He would sit on a hay bale and watch them together, and every time he watched them, he learned something new about what love really meant. He learned that love was not just about romance or excitement or dramatic moments. Love was about showing up day after day. Love was about patience. Love was about being willing to stand in the freezing cold for weeks, watching and waiting and refusing to give up hope. Love was about using your own body to shield someone from suffering. Love was about sharing your food when you are hungry, sharing your warmth when you are cold, sharing your life with someone completely and totally. By late spring, when the weather had truly become warm and the snow was completely gone, Thomas led both horses out to the pasture for the first time. The young mare walked on her own now, her legs strong again, her body healthy again. The Dark Colt walked beside her, as he always did, never leaving her side, never straying more than a few feet away from her. When they reached the wide open pasture with its green grass and clear streams, the young mare stopped and stood still for a moment. Thomas could see her looking around, seeing this world of freedom and beauty and peace. Then she began to walk toward the grass, and the Dark Colt walked with her. The news of what had happened on Thomas's ranch spread through the community. At first, people did not believe the story. They said Thomas was exaggerating, that no horse could be that loyal, that no animal could love another animal that much. But then people came to see for themselves. They came to Thomas's ranch and watched the Dark Colt and the young mare grazing together in the pasture. They watched how the stallion would position himself between the mare and any danger. They watched how the two horses would rest their heads against each other at the end of the day. They watched how the Dark Colt would nicker softly to the mare throughout the day, as if constantly checking on her, constantly making sure she was okay. Gradually, the opinions of Thomas's neighbors began to change. The men who had called the Dark Colt worthless and cursed and crazy began to see him differently. They began to understand that they had been wrong. What they had interpreted as strangeness was actually nobility. What they had seen as weakness was actually strength. What they had dismissed as worthlessness was actually the most valuable quality of all, the ability to love completely and faithfully, and without any expectation of reward. Old Frank, the rancher who had told Thomas to put the Dark Colt down, came to the ranch one afternoon. He stood by the fence and watched the two horses grazing together in the evening light. Thomas stood beside him, and they did not speak for a long time. Finally, Frank said, "I was wrong about that horse." "I was wrong about a lot of things." Thomas simply nodded. There was no need to say more. By the time summer arrived fully, the young mare was completely healed. She was strong and healthy and beautiful. The Dark Colt had become the most respected horse on Thomas's ranch and in the entire community. People would come from other towns to see him, to hear the story of his loyalty, to witness for themselves the bond between him and the young mare. But the two horses did not seem to notice the attention. They were content to spend their days together in the pasture, grazing, running, playing in the streams, enjoying the simple pleasures of life together. Thomas would sit on the fence and watch them in the late afternoon, when the sun was turning everything gold, when the world seemed peaceful and right and full of meaning. He would think about the Dark Colt standing in the freezing cold, watching and waiting and refusing to abandon his love. He would think about the young mare trapped in that dark ravine, suffering but never losing hope that someone would come to help her. He would think about his own life, about the loneliness he had felt for so many years, about how he had thought his life was over and meaningless. But watching these two horses, Thomas understood that his life had not been over at all. His life had been preparing him for this moment, for this purpose. He had been alone, not because he was cursed or worthless, but because he was meant to understand loneliness deeply enough to recognize it in another being. He had suffered not because he was weak, but because suffering teaches us compassion. He had lived all these years not for himself, but so that he could be here, at this exact moment in time, to save a young mare and to witness the most beautiful love story ever told. As Thomas sat on the fence and watched the Dark Colt and the young mare standing together in the golden evening light, he realized that life had given him a gift. It had given him a reason to believe in love. It had given him proof that loyalty and faithfulness and devotion were not fairy tales or fantasy. They were real. They existed in the hearts of animals who loved completely. And if animals could love that way, then perhaps humans could too. Perhaps Thomas himself, in helping to save the young mare, had learned to love in a deeper way than he ever had before. The story of the Dark Colt and the young mare became a legend in that valley, a story that people told their children and their grandchildren. But for Thomas, it was not just a story. It was a life lesson, written in the language of loyalty and love, spoken by two horses who had refused to give up on each other, written in the snow and the ice and the frozen fence line where a stallion had stood watch, waiting for salvation to arrive. And when Thomas died many years later, it was the memory of that Dark Colt and that young mare that stayed with him, that gave his life meaning, that proved to him that he had mattered, that his presence on this earth had made a difference.